Hello, everybody. This is Brian Kittler with the Pinchot Institute. We also have Maureen McDonough with Michigan State University on the line as well. We're just going to wait one more minute. We've got a number of people registered for the webinar, so before we get rolling, we just want to make sure that we get as much participation as we can. Okay. Again, thanks so much for participating in our webinar today. This is Brian Kittler with the Pinchot Institute for Conservation. I direct our Western Regional Office in Portland. And we also have Maureen McDonough with Michigan State University on the line. Maureen and I lead this project for the Forest Service. We also work with the Watershed Research and Training Center in Hayfork, California. And the purpose of our webinar today is to basically review some lessons that we've learned and some feedback we've been receiving through a set of case studies examining the use of stewardship contracting across the national forests. And specifically, this slide here, you can actually see which projects we were looking at. The National Forest and Grasslands in green, and the 15 projects across the country depicted as the stars here. Just a technical thing to start. Folks, if you have questions as we work through these slides, please enter them into the chat pod, and we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. And we'll get rolling. Hopefully, if I can, there we go. Okay, so we're going to start off with an intro poll. Just want to get a sense for who's on the phone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics of stewardship contracting and its background and history. I'm going to work through the methods that we used to evaluate case studies, and we're going to look at the results from those case studies, and we'll end with an exit poll and hopefully get to our Q&A period. So starting off, just take a few minutes here, and if you would please answer these questions, and we can see who we've got on the phone and what your background is in stewardship.
Okay, so this is Maureen. Again, welcome everyone. So you can see that, let's see, actually most people on this call, in this webinar, are from the Northeast or Lake States, 36%, followed by the Southeast at 22%, the Northern Rockies, and then the Pacific Coast and the Central Rockies.
Okay, so on to our next question.
Right. Well, most people on the call are from the Forest Service, almost 60%, followed by nonprofits at 22%, and private sector, and then other public agencies. Other gets 0%. And the next question. So there's quite a variety of experiences with stewardship contracting. 46% have no experience with stewardship contracting. And then 1 to 3 projects, 33% have experience in 1 to 3 projects. A few of you, 10%, are very, very experienced with 10 plus projects. Okay, so most of you are interested in stewardship contracting to achieve specific outcomes, followed by to get work done on the ground and to use local contractors. I do want to comment that over the many years that Brian and I have been working in this monitoring of community engagement in stewardship contracting, those are the things that participants in stewardship contracts say the most as well, to achieve specific outcomes and get work done on the ground. All right, 75% have experience with goods or services, and that, again, goes along with about the last 10 years of data about which authorities are used most, and then followed by retained receipts and best value contracting, designation by description, and long-term contracts. And then the last question in the intro poll. Is that most people are involved in the collaborative process, but not in a formal group, which makes sense, seeing as most people on the call are with the Forest Service. But then again, Forest Service responding to public comments, so that quite a few of the participants in this webinar, and then We have a few citizens, 2%, and 21% are members of collaborative groups. And that's the last question for the intro poll, and hopefully that gave you all a sense of who else is participating in this webinar.
Great. All right, thanks for taking the time to do that. Kind of helps us tailor our message a little bit, given who we have on the phone. So as most of you will know, stewardship contracting, it's become a very important tool for natural resource management and ecosystem restoration on the national forests. It's grown significantly in the last 10 years. The acreage under stewardship authorities has nearly tripled. And another indicator of growth, the use of stewardship authorities now represents about 25 to 30% of the total timber volume produced on the national forests. We have less data and statistics on the service side of stewardship contracts, no less important though. And stewardship is also being used in many high-profile projects such as collaborative forest landscape restoration program projects, Joint Chiefs projects, and others. And one significant driver is with stewardship, it allows the use of and development of integrated projects which are consistent with and conducive to achieving the multiple use objectives and mandate of the Forest Service. So what stewardship contracting really is, again, this is to be a refresher for most folks. There are specific categories defined in the legislation for activities that are authorized, so road and trail maintenance and obliteration, maintenance of soil productivity, habitat and fisheries management, use of prescribed fire, watershed restoration, vegetative removal, and control of invasive species. So collectively, these stewardship activities should essentially be the type of work that you see in any set of stewardship contracts. Not every project is going to have all of this work, but a lot of them have more than one of these activities embedded within a stewardship contract or agreement. And what those contracts and agreements really are, it's a collection of authorities that the agencies can use to design projects. And best value contracting is a really unique authority. It's not really present in many other instances on any federal public lands management, but basically it requires the use of other criteria in addition to cost when awarding projects. So prior experience, the skills and expertise of the contractors, whether the contractor is or agreement holder is a local entity, all of those things get weighed into awarding projects. Authorities also allow for multi-year or multiple year contracting, and this basically can facilitate projects up to 10 years in length. Designation by prescription, it allows projects to basically allows contractors to achieve the desired end results of the project on the ground. So really focus on the outcomes and allows for some operational flexibility. So less prescriptive than, say, a timber sale contract or a service contract in some instances. Designation by description basically allows for trees to be removed or retained without the use of physical marking. So trying to find some efficiencies, some cost efficiencies for getting these projects done. And less than full and open competition, this typically is used only in agreements and allows the agency to sole source work with a specific single entity. Trading goods for services, again, reflecting back on the intro poll, this is something that people typically think about with stewardship contracting. And typically it's the value of timber that then gets exchanged for achieving and implementing service work. So that could be any of the other stewardship activities that we talked about on the previous slide. So it's essentially that trade, that market trade between timber and service items. embedded within a single project area. The other option is retaining those receipts and then applying those receipts in other projects on the elsewhere in the forest into the future. And there's a whole set of sort of rules and norms that are used for actually doing that in stewardship contracting. So the last element, and this kind of gets, I think, a lot to what we look at with our case studies, is allowing the agency to work with non-traditional bidders. So stewardship authorities have really widened who the agency is working with on projects on the ground in implementation and monitoring, and in project design and development. So nonprofits, local governments, stewardship agreements have really come online pretty significantly in the last few years as one of the main mechanisms for widening the range of people that the agency is working with. And as you can see over time, 2003 to 2013, that was the period in which the Forest Service had semi-permanent or provisional authority, and we saw steady growth. And that was recognized, and in the 2014 Farm Bill, we saw permanent authorization from Congress to use these stewardship authorities going forward. And since that time, we've seen a pretty consistent level of acres awarded each year from the Forest Service. So another important element of stewardship contracting has really been hardwired into the legislation, but then also in sort of the background evolution of this tool, is that community benefits are really implicit in stewardship contracting and the authorities. And we already talked a little bit about that. But a lot of this comes back to the early days in which communities, local communities, were really the driving force of a number of the early kind of high-profile stewardship projects. And this is right, at the 10 to 20 years ago, when the Forest Service was first experimenting with using stewardship authorities, and then implementing some priority projects on the ground in partnership with communities. Now, over time, what we've observed, both through these case studies in previous years, but then also through a national survey that we implemented, we have observed that local communities have been engaging more and more, not sort of one-on-one with the Forest Service in specific local projects, but more through collaborative processes. And likely this is linked to the broader sort of evolution in collaborative work across the national forests. And the agency has fairly recently updated the handbook itself, recognizing this and saying that collaboration must be a part of stewardship contracting project planning and continue through the life of the project. And the reasons for this are largely because, going back to that community benefits piece and the benefits of working with local and non-agency stakeholders, have been shown both through this monitoring program, but then also through anecdotal evidence on the ground. And just a quick background on the monitoring. Again, in that pilot period, back close to 20 years ago now, the Institute worked with a number of entities to really look at the first set of stewardship contracts. So we collected a number of data, socioeconomic data, ecological data, really understanding how these pilot authorities were being used. And during the 10-year provisional authority, we implemented a survey of 25% of the projects. And since permanent authority in the Farm Bill, we've been conducting case studies of representative projects across the National Forest System to better understand the use of these authorities, better understand how communities and non-agency stakeholders are engaging, and how the Forest Service can continue to grow the use of stewardship contracting and the benefits it provides to the public. Okay.
Okay, so there are 5 broad monitoring questions that we pursue in these case studies, and these 5 questions developed in cooperation with the Forest Service. So the first question is, how are non-agency stakeholders engaged in the life of the project? So from beginning to end. Question 2. Secondly, we're interested in whether relationships in general and communication in particular between agency and non-agency stakeholders has changed due to involvement in these projects. And then question 3 is at what project steps or stages, what do the agency participants and the non-agency stakeholders feel are most important for involvement, and given those, are they satisfied with the level of engagement? So for example, if they say monitoring is most important, then are they satisfied with the level of monitoring? Question number 4, as you will see from the results and from your experience, diversity of participation, there's a lot of diversity of participation. There's many ways that non-agency stakeholders are engaged, and so this question is about whether diversity of participation is somehow related to perceptions of project success. For example, are collaborative projects, if a project's more collaborative or has a collaborative, are those perceived as more successful? And then the last question is, how does the engagement of non-agency stakeholders influence the scale, meaning size, and scope, meaning complexity of these projects? And so our approach, we selected 15 projects among projects that were initiated between 2012 to 2015. When Brian he'll show you the list of projects, and you can, when he shows you that table, these are the selection criteria. We wanted the projects geographically distributed across regions. We wanted small projects and large projects. We wanted both agreements and contracts. And we wanted projects that had standing collaborative groups and ones that did not have a formal collaborative group. The way this works is we contact the agency person first, and we use a snowball sampling technique, and the agency person gives us a list of the participants, the primary participants. We also collect data on secondary, but the primary participants. And then when we call those people and interview them, we ask them for names of additional people. So we're triangulating on a complete list. 2 to 7 people were interviewed per project. The goal was 5. Some projects, as you'll see, there are only 2 people, the agency person and the contractor. So that accounts for that range. And this year we did 47, in 2016, 47 interviews total, 17 Forest Service folks. There were multiple on a couple of projects. We interviewed more than one, and 30 non-agency folks. We developed an interview protocol based on those 5 questions. So we didn't just ask those questions straight out. We broke them down into smaller pieces and developed an interview protocol. The interviewers were trained, and then we did a qualitative analysis of the transcripts, all the recordings. Each interview is recorded. It comes to Brian. We get them transcribed, and then we do a qualitative analysis looking for the answers to those 5 questions.
Okay. So again, these are the 15 projects we looked at. And again, we were looking for a nice cross-section of the type of projects out there. So we looked at both agreements, IRTCs, or Integrated Resource Timber contracts, and Integrated Resource Service contracts. And we looked for broad geographic diversity across the national forests. We looked for both large projects and smaller projects. And typically, if you look at the average acreage across all stewardship projects, there seems to be a break point around 1,000 acres, where anything over that is, larger. We have some that are significantly larger than 1,000 acres. And again, we also looked at both collaborative groups being present in these projects and projects that had less formal or structured collaboratives or sort of one-on-one relationships. Another variable that we looked at, and asked about is whether whether stewardship was considered prior to initiating a NEPA process. So in some instances, stewardship authorities or a stewardship contract really was sort of not thought of early on in the development of projects. So just real quick, starting in the Southeast, I just want to say a couple things about these projects. We have some nice summaries of each of these projects that provide a lot more detail, but I'm just going to hit the high points here. In the South, with the Talladega National Forest, this was an agreement with a regional conservation organization that didn't really have a lot of background in stewardship at all. They brought on a new staff member who actually did have a lot of background, and that individual identified one district that they knew on the Talladega where they could implement the type of work that they would want to do and where they would have find basically a receptive partner. So this was very much an externally driven project. Moving west into Texas, the Davy Crockett, the collaboration in this project was somewhat unique across all the projects that we looked at in the last 3 years, where they were actually using a resource advisory committee. They were using a resource advisory committee as a way to basically review projects, proposals, modify projects, and it seems to be working out pretty well for them. On the Chattahoochee, this was not a formal collaborative group present on this project. Similar to these two other projects in the Southeast, this Chattahoochee project is really focused on opening up the stands to promote a more savanna-type habitat in these pine ecosystems. And in this instance, the collaborators or the non-agency participants are a set of scientists from local agencies and universities specializing in rare plants. So they were participating in the NEPA process, helping the agency with technical support that the agency and capacity that the agency just didn't have on staff. Moving into the Northeast, into the Lake States, in the Chippewa National Forest, this was an instance where the agency had not really engaged with external stakeholders in developing or conceiving of a project, but saw an opportunity to do some timber management and then use the receipts to implement a bunch of different service activities. This was another project where we saw some transitions in staff on the forest, and the incoming staff had actually done, I think, based on what we've heard, a better job in engaging and trying to get some collaborative work started with external participants in the region. Over in Michigan, in the Huron-Manistee, this project involved a recreation group, a motorized recreation group, has a long history on the forest with the trails there, and has provided some in-kind support to developing and implementing projects. This was another project where staff transitions were a factor. This entity, this external group, actually serves the role sort of as when new staff come on, they'll go out and they'll meet with the agency, they'll talk about the stewardship work that their organization has done in partnership with the Forest Service, and it's a nice sort of way of providing some continuity in those projects. Moving west, the project on the Lolo National Forest, this was a larger IRTC. There was a collaborative group present, and this was actually part of a CFLR project as well. And the objectives and the strategies used in this individual project are directly tied to the broader collaborative effort at a larger landscape. This project involved a number of diverse objectives. They were looking at endangered species habitat for a bunch of different species, Canadian lynx, grizzly bear, bull trout, and they're doing some timber management as well as some hazardous fuels reduction and road obliteration and general restoration work. This project was a long time in development. It ended up in litigation, and in this instance, having that community engagement and the involvement of non-agency stakeholders basically involved from day one, from conceiving of the project on through to implementation, really helped the agency when they ended up in court with these non-agency participants basically providing and supporting the agency through that process and filing amicus briefs and that kind of thing. So it moved the project along in a number of different ways. In the Nez Perce project, similarly, this was a long-term project. It took over a decade to be developed and implement. It also involved a collaborative group, and it, similar set of objectives to the Lobo project. The agreement in the Black Hills is a pretty interesting project in the sense that it involves the county government, and this is a large 10-year agreement that they have in place with the county government to do a number of different projects. But this was the first set of projects that they were going to be implementing together as partners. And it was interestingly, when we asked the agency, what are your goals with this project? What are your objectives? They specifically said to establish and maintain a strong relationship with the county. So that was kind of an interesting outcome of that project. Moving down to the Pike San Isabel, this project is another sort of hazardous fuels oriented project in a municipal watershed. They have a payment for watershed services mechanism, so a lot of the non-agency engagement really centers around doing monitoring on treatments to inform the entity investing in that landscape. So they want to know the effectiveness of those treatments. So having that non-agency involvement, both in providing the funding and in providing the monitoring services, has been really important. The Santa Fe project, this is a very large project across close to 100,000 acres, involving numerous partners. Monitoring is an extremely important part of this project as well, with a number of universities and agency scientists providing that monitoring. And they have a really interesting collaborative process associated with the project. And it's also linked to a CFLR project. The agreement on the Dixie National Forest is, again, with a wildlife conservation organization. They're using an interesting approach to collaborate at the state level in Utah to look at priorities for watershed investment. So the state is putting some money into this project as well, and working with the conservation group on the implementation side of it. Moving to the Pacific Coast, the Integrated Resource Service contract on the Lassen National Forest. This is a smaller salvage project. The Forest Service had put it up as a timber sale. They didn't see any bids on it, so they repackaged it into a stewardship contract, into an IRSC. And in this instance, there really wasn't a lot of external participation. The repackaging process did involve some consultation, some field workshops, basically with potential contractors to help ensure that the project would be something palatable to industry. This Shasta Trinity project was an interesting project in the sense that they tried to go to a very, very, very large scale for that area. It involved a collaborative group and a collaborative process at the pre-NEPA phase and the planning phase. The objectives to go to scale were pretty clear within that group. As it proceeded in NEPA and through consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Marine Fisheries Service around some Endangered Species Act issues, the scale of the project was constrained. And during that period, over several years, communications back with those entities, those non-agency entities, non-Forest Service participants, suffered, and it kind of left a lot of poor feelings around that project and poor understanding around that project and the landscape. And the last project, the Okanagan Wenatchee project, Again, this is a collaborative group project. It was the first project out of a collaborative forest landscape restoration program project. And in this instance, this is a project that had already gone through NEPA. It was kind of shelf stock project, and they didn't necessarily have the buy-in from all the participants in sort of the design phase. So some of those communications and expectations could have been improved potentially with some earlier participation in the pre-NEPA planning process. Okay, so getting into the specific answers to the monitoring questions. And again, what we looked at was interviews and transcripts from those interviews and common themes across all of those agency and non-agency responses. And what we observed and what we found with our first point of inquiry, so how are non-agency stakeholders engaged in the development and implementation of stewardship projects? So again, participation occurs at all stages in these projects. We saw several projects that were pre-NEPA, several projects where people came in at a later stage. 5 of the projects had structured collaborative groups. 3 were CFLRPs. Non-agency engagement via NEPA scoping and pre-NEPA planning are the most common forms of engagement, and they tend to be involved, and people that tend to be involved earlier tend to be involved in more collaborative projects. Non-agency participants overwhelmingly feel that engaging in pre-NEPA plannings is the most important way for them to be involved. They want to be involved early. They want to influence the design of projects. We also observe that project outcomes and the scope of projects tend to be broader when they're collaboratively defined. So we see more integrated projects coming out of projects involving more participants, which you would think would make sense. You have different people coming in with different ideas, different expectations, different things they want to see in these projects. The other aspect of engaging non-agency participants, which provides some benefit to the agency, is additional capacity. I mentioned in the Chattahoochee project that there's a specific technical capacity that these external participants brought. And in several of the other projects, the monitoring capacity, they were looking at the types of ecosystem and ecological and even economic metrics that really aren't tracked necessarily by the agency currently within those landscapes. So it's providing some additional expertise. And again, across all of these projects, so these 15 case studies, we looked at how are non-agency stakeholders engaging and what are sort of the strategies in which and points within the project that they're engaging. So again, we had 5 projects. Here you can see that were included an established structured collaborative group, 3 of which were part of a CFLR program project. We also had this technical support role where non-agency participants largely identify in providing direct technical support to the agency and augmenting the agency's capacity. And then again, we have NEPA public engagement, sort of the more traditional forms of public engagement, direct mailings, field tours, that kind of thing. So the second question, have relationships between the Forest Service and external stakeholders changed due to the involvement in working together in stewardship contracting projects? So what we observe in these projects is, it's not necessarily a single project that people identify as improving or degrading their relationship. It's the experience of working together or not working together over several years and several different projects. When people identify that their relationships had improved, it's typically due, again, to working together over a long period of time, which leads to increased trust and cooperation. Getting involved early on, and that's either on their own volition or being invited to participate by the agency. Relationships improved also when strong leadership occurs, when people see that something is going to happen. They trust that, and they're willing to put the time in and work to develop that relationship, develop those projects. Open and transparent communications was also a very important factor. When people know what to expect, when the objectives are clear, when the working relationships and sort of those lines of communication are well established, relationships do improve, and projects, and it can help actually implement projects. Another aspect of where people identify relationships had been improved was due to the ability to leverage resources. So, people are bringing their own capacity or expertise. They're bringing a labor force. They're bringing, in some cases, equipment into these projects. That allows, kind of a quid pro quo, or, help me out kind of relationship, and people are able to work together. Where relationships suffer, again, sort of converse to having open and transparent communications, is instances where, hey, you didn't tell me that you were going to do that, or you didn't explain why this agency rule exists. Working with external stakeholders, as Forest Service folks on the phone likely have experienced, can be really challenging in communicating the intricacies of agency policies and rules and why things are done the way they are. But it's extremely important to be able to explain that. And we see that in sort of how these relationships develop over time. And again, I think the other aspect of that we observe is expectations and establishing expectations in these relationships and in these projects. So another really significant factor is transitional leadership and staffing changes. So in these projects, in 5 of these 15 case studies, we had staffing changes identified, agency staffing changes identified as one of the main reasons why projects were negatively effective. So timelines dragged on, communication suffered. In some instances, there were procedures in place to help with that process, and others there just weren't. And this graph here is just basically showing instances in which respondents in our case studies identified that their relationships had actually changed as a result of working together on stewardship contracting projects. So not just the single project, but all the projects. So I think this is a strong indication that coming together and working through issues in projects does actually affect working relationships. So third question, what project phases do participants feel are most important for non-agency stakeholder involvement? And are participants satisfied with the level of non-agency stakeholder engagement? So, I sound a bit like a broken record here, but engaging as early as possible, pre-NEPA, in early project conceptualization was actually this year, universally viewed as the most important time and way in which non-agency stakeholders can participate. We heard this both from Forest Service personnel and people external to the agency. Non-agency participants also this year in particular providing cost share funding in a number of these projects. You think of the Pike San Isabel project, where it's almost 100% funded by a payment for watershed services program. In several of the agreements, there's significant resources being brought in, both by, in this instance, a county government and 2 wildlife conservation organizations. The level of local knowledge that's also provided by these external stakeholders is really important at the design phase. And when these staff transitions do occur, which negatively impact relationships, at least in these 15, or I'm sorry, in 5 of these 15 projects, in some instances, having local people within that community, focused on work on that forest, are really important to bringing new staff up to speed. Most are satisfied with the level of non-agency engagement or with their engagement with the agency in instances where they're not a Forest Service person. Typically, within these projects, what we observed was a dissatisfaction really occurred when they weren't involved early enough. So I'll talk about this on the next slide, but there's a few instances where the project really had been kind of prepackaged, and then the agency tried to do sort of a collaborative process around it, and relationships suffered, and there were some issues that emerged. So again, challenges to engaging non-agency participants in these projects. So not being transparent or clear with communications, not establishing those clear lines of communications early on. Funding and the availability of funding was cited as an inhibitor to working together, both by agency folks and non-agency participants. And this is because it just takes a lot of time to engage in collaborative work. In a few projects, this was also identified as limiting who could actually be at the table. So in one instance, it was, a participant saying, well, we can only get there on the weekends, and during the work week, these meetings were being scheduled at times where, retirees from the community or paid professionals were the only folks that could participate. So that can also be a challenge to relationships and to successful design and implementation of projects. Another big factor here is just capacity and capability in designing and working together through collaborative processes. This is a skill set, and there are certain people that are wired for this type of work, and others who are less so. Training is a really important thing when you're going to be committing to trying to do this type of work. And in some instances, we see the benefits of that training working out on the ground, and others less so at this point. Okay, so again, this is just going through and showing which, in these projects, which types of non-agency engagement are typically viewed as being most important by the people we talk to. So you see very much kind of front-end project development and planning as being the most important phase that people think. And in terms of level of satisfaction, so I mentioned that in some of these projects that were designed prior to really having a lot of upfront non-agency engagement, and then they were inserted into a collaborative process. I think the Okanagan-Wenatchee project is a really good example of that. And then on the Shasta Trinity project, it was kind of the opposite, where you had a non-agency, stakeholder-driven collaborative process around project design, and that project design really didn't translate to project implementation. So you had some dissatisfaction there. And then on the Chippewa project, that one person who responded that they weren't satisfied with non-agency engagement was actually an agency representative who said that we didn't do a good job before I got here in terms of collaborative engagement. So fourth question, how is diversity and participation related to perceptions of project success? Most people felt that projects were a success, and typically that's because they are seeing the objectives that they're after actually being implemented and the outcomes being achieved on the ground. In these projects, participants, they're saying that, we're seeing a project that we planned and we worked on actually being implemented, and we consider that a success. Other elements were, building these positive relationships. People identify that building trust between the agency and non-agency participants is another indicator of success in these landscapes. So again, we didn't really see any clear tie between the diversity of participation and whether people view these projects as successful. In some of these projects, we had, we talked to up to 6 non-agency participants, and they were just a handful of the actual participants in these projects. In some projects, there's really only 1 or 2 people. Maureen said possibly the agency and the contractor. So, it's really difficult to tease out based on this case study methodology whether diversity of participation really leads to any change in perceptions of project success. And again, given how these authorities are structured and what they facilitate in the design and implementation of projects, people recognize the innovation and the opportunity for innovation. So if you get more people to the table in designing these projects early on, they're going to be bringing in new ideas, and if those ideas lead to the type of implementation on the ground that they want to see, typically that's how people are recognizing that we're seeing success on the ground. So in the couple instances, or the one instance really, where a project was not seen as a success, again, on the Shasta Trinity project, folks were really aiming for a large landscape scale project that got constrained down to a smaller footprint. So they were unwilling to classify as a success, even though they recognized that it actually is significantly more acreage being achieved on the ground than the forest had been able to achieve in a long time. So in terms of how involving non-agency stakeholders influences the scale and scope of stewardship projects, in instances where projects were planned by the agency alone, that scope and that scale were both sort of predefined, so we didn't observe any real change. In instances where we saw increased public participation or collaboration in designing projects, complexity was actually something that increased. And interestingly, this year, more so than other years of doing case studies, respondents define complexity of projects in terms of relationships and communications. In years past, it was more, projects got more complex because people had different ideas and we started implementing different activities. This year was really, hey, this is hard. These projects are complex because there's a lot of communications that need to be maintained. So that was kind of an interesting finding, I think, in particular for this year. So another aspect in terms of scaling projects, in a couple instances, projects were actually scaled down to meet the capacity constraints of the local contractors in the area. And largely that was viewed as a very positive aspect of designing projects. In a few instances, in the more sort of IRTC timber-oriented projects, where really the external stakeholders were purchasers and purchasers only, the projects tended to be more simple in design, and I think that is some indicator of a level of comfort in contractors being willing to look at certain objectives and certain tasks and unwilling to look at others. So the process of working together, project design really tended to be more timber-oriented in those instances. I will note that, those opinions and sort of they're not universally held with a timber contractor, that those are the only activities that they're interested in. In other projects, we saw representatives from sawmills really participating in the design of the service aspect of projects as much as the timber aspect of projects. So it's kind of interesting to observe that diversity across the system. Here, these two charts on the left here, so did the involvement of non-agency stakeholders influence the scale of the project? And this year, I think it's kind of different than in other years. In other years, we saw more instances where, yes, the involvement almost universally did affect the scale. This year, we really saw a split where in some instances, people felt like, it really wasn't so much about the scale as it was about the design of projects and the complexity within that project area. In terms of the complexity and whether or not engaging with people external to the agency changes the scope or the complexity, by and large, in these projects, respondents would say actually it had. In some cases significantly, in some cases it was about the number of activities, the diversity of activities. In other cases it was more so about, again, the communications that needed to be maintained over the project lifespan. Okay, so we're going to wrap things up here with an exit poll and a Q&A session.
Okay, so the exit poll is really to give you and us a chance to see, to kind of process the information that Brian just presented. So here's the first question: do these observations from the most recent data resonate with your experience? So go ahead and answer it. All right, so many of these observations resonate with the participants, and for some, a few resonate. So clearly there are some, hopefully there's some new information here for you that you didn't think about before. The second question is about your experience in stewardship contracting, and in your experience, how do non-agency stakeholders most often participate? Okay, so the answer is pretty evenly distributed, but the most are providing comments during NEPA scoping. I just make comment that only 10% say experiences with planning pre-NEPA, and the data show this year and in previous years that planning pre-NEPA is most important to non-agency stakeholders. Next question. Let's ask you about your experience again, and which factor is most important for promoting quality relationships in your experience. And the most important, 45%, is open, transparent communication and decision-making, which again, the participants in the case study interviews for this go-around also indicated that's important. And then other responses are pretty evenly distributed. And then this is, again, another question that we ask the participants, but what aspects of the project are most important for non-agency participants to be involved in? And the responses, 82% engaging early on, and that's completely it's completely consistent with the responses from both the agency and non-agency participants. Based on your experience, what factor can most readily degrade relationships? So 58% of you believe it's poor communication and lack of transparency, which is interesting because it fits with the data as well. And then the other answers, except for collaboration fatigue, are pretty evenly distributed. And not many respondents this year said collaboration fatigue. Okay. And this is the last question. Which factor do you think is most important, the most important metric of success for stewardship contracting projects? With the exception of enabling public participation and building positive relationships, the other three responses are pretty even: getting a planned contract completed, increasing the scale and scope of restoration, and building trust. Brian?
Okay. So we have some questions that folks have entered in that we would like to comment on. We've got about 6 minutes here. So I'm going to work through these, and people, if you still have additional questions, please just type them in and we'll hopefully be able to get to them. I would mention that we haven't yet released the report, and I went through all of this very quickly. So if you're interested in these topics, if you want to learn more about these individual projects, just contact me, or we'll make sure you get a copy of the report once it comes out. So our first question here is not necessarily about the subject matter that we've been talking about, but it's asking, what percentage of stewardship contracts are below cost? That is, they generate less revenue than the cost to achieve objectives. So that's an interesting question that I don't necessarily have a clear answer to. I have recently looked at some cut and sold reports for stewardship contracts across the entire National Forest System that did show revenue achieved on the ground. But yeah, I think that's not necessarily something that we've looked into. Okay, so we have another question here. Many of our collaborators want to be cooperating so they can provide input into NEPA, but then they don't really help with specific comments. So I think this is sort of an interesting question, and I'm going to try to repackage it or reframe it. So people are saying in this instance that they may want to participate, they want to provide comments in NEPA in this instance, or they at least maybe they want to participate earlier on, but then they will follow through. Without having context, it's a little difficult to answer this specific instance, but I think this is one where just consistency of communications and giving people that platform and multiple platforms to participate sounds like it could be an important factor in allowing them to do so. Another question asking what's the solution to staff transitions? You know, I don't necessarily know if there's one specific silver bullet. There was a memo that was produced a few years back that is floating out there with sort of best practices and how to weather the storm of those transitions. If interested, I'd be happy to follow up and send that to anyone interested.
Can I comment on that, Brian?
Yes.
This is Maureen. I think one of the potential solutions is a culture where being collaborative and working with citizens on these projects is expected wherever you go, as opposed to having changes in people and people come in, new people come in, and there doesn't appear to be an expectation that that's what they have to do. And so I think that's one solution, but that's a very long-term solution.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm remembering a few instances where on projects, I'm thinking in particular the Santa Fe project, where someone came in from a different region that, that region was kind of, that they were coming from was really known for collaboration. But then they came to this project and they, the depth of sort of involvement in different phases of the project really surprised them. And the type of collaboration, the type of entities involved was really different from where they were coming from. So there's, yeah, I mean, promoting a culture of collaboration and engagement is really important, but it's going to, I think, ultimately look different in different places given how diverse the country is and how diverse the national forests are. Any other questions or comments that we can get to here? And otherwise, we'll wrap up. Question here. So I'm going to also be participating next week in a session here with Region 6, sort of a peer-to-peer learning session. And we will be folding in some of these findings into that discussion. And I guess the last point that I'll make is a lot of, I was going through updating a past presentation from last year, and a lot of what we found last year is fairly consistent with what we found this year to these five, in answering these 5 questions. So, I think that's an indicator that progress can still be made. And unless there's any other last questions, I think we'll wrap up here. Thanks so much, everybody, for participating. Feel free to contact me at this address here or give me a call. And I will leave you with that happy ungulate in that picture there. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thanks for participating.